Hello. I said we'd use this heat wave as an opportunity to talk more about climate change and the climate crisis. And boy, do I have a treat for you today. I spent an hour this afternoon talking to George Monbiot, a man who needs no introduction, although I'll give him a short one anyway. As you'll probably know, he's a Guardian columnist. He's written multiple books on climate change, global democracy, the nature of power, rewilding the country, and what needs to change about our food system. We covered a lot about most of those issues, in fact. We talked about his vision for how we should deal with climate change, why he thinks it all depends on whether a social tipping point comes before an environmental one. We also discussed geoengineering, an issue that regular viewers will know I'm interested in. We had a great back and forth there, I think. We also talked about what he thinks is the most important technology ever. That's a quote, and it is precision fermentation. It's a route to get protein without animal products, without animal husbandry. He thinks this is also a much better option than lab-grown meat, which is too expensive. We begin the conversation, though, talking about today's big news, which is Nigel Farage and his by-election. I hope you enjoy the interview as much as I did conducting it. Here's George Monbiot. Thank you so much for joining us on Novara Media.
That's totally my pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
And just because I know the comments will be full of this question, what's going on with your bookshelf? Are you starting an eBay business for secondhand tomes?
We're in the process of moving house, so it's all boxes and chaos at the moment, and we're moving into, well, it's a bit of a building site still, but I think there's a toilet, so should be all right.
So that's the main thing. We're mainly going to talk about climate change today, sort of inspired by the heat wave, I suppose. Talk about the UK government's approach to it, how we're doing as a global community when it comes to confronting climate change. Before that, though, I want to start on some of this week's big headlines, because I know it's also something you write about, money in politics. Nigel Farage and money in politics is something I know you've written about for The Guardian a lot. So I want to get your thoughts on this by-election that Nigel Farage has called. I mean, I suppose the decision by all the other parties not to stand against him.
Well, I've never had any fixed political loyalties being a journalist, but I suddenly find myself with a strong penchant for Count Binface. Go Binface. Binface versus Bin Juice. No contest. We've got to see that win. I mean, wouldn't it be beautiful? It would be sheer poetry. I mean, what we see is this world-class grifter who has claimed all along to be the voice of the common man, the man and woman, the ordinary people in the street. I'm with you. I'm a good guy to have a pint with. And, you know, we knew this guy was just making money hand over fist by all sorts of weird means, including his bizarre and often outrageous cameo videos. But now we know that he's been receiving all these undisclosed payments, including £5 million from a billionaire, crypto billionaire based in Thailand, as well as all sorts of donations and in kind from a convicted fraudster, George Cottrell. And the fact that he failed to declare these, the fact that he's taking them at all, in my view, is pretty scandalous. But his failure to declare them shows that this is a man who has a lot to hide, that he's even less trustworthy than most of us assumed, and that he shouldn't be anywhere near our politics.
And you might have some thoughts on this, because you cover the populist right a lot, you cover money in politics. Why is it the case that these populist right politicians are always in bed with crypto? What is the connection? I've asked lots of people this, and people give reasonable answers, but I still haven't got the one thing that makes it all make sense.
Sure. Well, I mean, crypto is, in most cases, a pyramid scheme. It's a blinking great scam where some people, like Donald Trump, for instance, get tremendously rich by fleecing everyone else. And that's kind of what the far right does. The two worldviews seem to align pretty closely. It's also very striking, incidentally, that there are a very large number of property developers involved in the far right and the extreme right. So, for instance, Trump was a property developer, the treasurer of Reform, property developer, the deputy chair of Reform, a property developer. And property developers, by and large, as a general statement, make their money by clearing people out the way, by getting rid of all those interfering people who might not like what they're doing, getting a clean slate and starting again with some massive great tower or something. Maybe they could put their name on it, but either way, they want to make a lot of money out of it. And both of those worldviews, a shakedown operation or a pyramid scheme on the one hand, a sort of land clearance, people clearance, democracy clearance scheme on the other hand, those align with the aims of the radical right and the far right. It has also to be said that there's always been secret funding of the far right in this country. So, for instance, Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was from quite early on. It founded in 1932. Almost from the beginning, was secretly funded by Mussolini's government in Italy. And of course, they didn't want that to come out because it would look disloyal, unpatriotic to have a foreign sponsor like that, and went to great lengths to try to hide that connection. And of course, here's another thing that we see about the far right and the radical right, is that they always claim to be patriots, but they will sell the country down the river for the sake of their sponsors and donors. And that is an absolutely solid rule of radical right politics, that they are the least patriotic people you'll ever meet because their loyalties lie offshore. They lie where the money is. They lie where the power is. And we've seen Farage fawning to Trump, fawning to Putin, fawning to Elon Musk, fawning to a great assortment of gruesome billionaires around the world, and spending far more time with them than he spends with his own constituents.
Yeah, we were talking on yesterday's show about how ridiculous it was for Farage to say it's tantamount to communism for the Labour Party to have introduced some funding limits for people who don't live in Britain. Like if you're supposed to be the nationalist patriotic party, you shouldn't consider it communism to say funding should really come from the country you're running in.
Well, can I just say one thing, that those Labour Party limits are absolutely pathetic and risible. I mean, the political funding system as a whole is an absolute disgrace. And of course, Farage represents an extreme and revolting end of that. But from top to toe, it is rotten. My proposal, which, obviously is far too scary for anyone in power to contemplate, is that there should be no private donations at all. Everyone can join a political party and pay a single set membership fee, no more, no less than, say, £25 a year. And then the state will match that at a given multiple. It might decide that the multiple for everyone across the board is going to be 3, for example. So if you had 100 members, you would get £2,500 from their membership fees. You get another £7,500 from the state. You get £10,000. And so it would be a completely level playing field. No one would be able to buy political parties. No one would be able to buy policy. And you would have a much, much fairer system. It might cost a few tens of millions of pounds, but that's nothing to the cost inflicted by the way in which our political system is just bought lock, stock and barrel by these billionaires. And the entire national policy is bent towards the demands of billionaires. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's Tories, Labour, Reform. They basically will all privilege the demands of corporations, oligarchs, multimillionaires and billionaires over the needs of the people. And one of the major reasons for that, not the only reason, but one of the major reasons, is our deeply corrupt and corrupting funding system.
Let's move on to climate change, which is what I invited you on to talk about this week. We wanted to use the opportunity of this heat wave where most of us have been moved out of the studio to talk about the climate crisis, kind of to try and model what we think the mainstream media should be doing, which is sort of using extreme weather events to talk about climate change. It can be a difficult issue to get people to engage with. Now, if there ever was a moment, is the moment. And I suppose you're someone who thinks a lot about climate change all year round. Do you still have an emotional response to what this week is the third heat wave of the year, which is very unusual.
Yeah, no, I have a very emotional response, not least because one of my neighbours died in it. She passed away. She was a remarkable woman with a really powerful sense of autonomy and lived life to the full. Very strong, very resilient, but with severe disabilities. And she died in the first wave of the heat wave. And from the point of view of the culture warriors who've been writing about this stuff in the Telegraph, the Mail, the Sun, and the rest of it, she's just collateral damage. It's like, it's just the same as with COVID. Let the bodies pile high. It's inconvenient for us to attend to the climate crisis. We don't want to think about this stuff. We don't want to contemplate even the inconvenient facts of things like heat waves and heat stress. So let's just allow people like that to shuffle off their mortal coil, and that's fine. We don't care. And it makes me very angry, very sad and very angry to see just how horribly neglected people are in a heat wave. It's obviously a reflection of how horribly neglected, vulnerable and poor people are at all times, but it comes to the fore at times when those vulnerabilities are made acute by extreme temperatures.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that. I didn't realize you would have had a sort of personal experience of loss in this time. I know you've written for The Guardian about how the right have come out and sort of said teachers should just get used to it, kids should get used to it. In 1976, we enjoyed the heat. What's everyone complaining about? You pushed back very strongly against that. I'm sure all of our audience would agree with you on that. I want to talk also about the missed opportunity, perhaps, from the actual government, or the more centre-left media, you could say. It feels like this could be a moment where climate change comes to the fore as a political issue. And instead, actually, in the sort of most severe heat wave, which was that June heat wave, the hottest June on record, the main talking point that week, as far as I can remember, was whether Ed Miliband had gone too far with net zero and whether we should U-turn on the decision not to go for more oil and gas in the North Sea. And it just seemed like a very strange juxtaposition to have that as a top story in a week when we were all, when schools were closing because it was too hot.
It's quite amazing. You had that right-wing ARC conference going on in London right in the middle of that heat wave where speaker after speaker was standing up saying, this climate scam, it has to stop. It's all a conspiracy cooked up by climate scientists trying to enrich themselves because everyone knows if you want to be a millionaire, become a climate scientist. And they were sweating. They were dripping in sweat while they were saying this. It's just utter madness. But, part of the problem, obviously there's a huge problem with fossil fuel lobbying, the immense power of this industry, which has been pouring hundreds of millions of pounds into politics to try to prevent the green transition from taking place. But there's also been real weakness from centrist political parties. And, while the Labour Party has got some quite good sort of practical climate policies on the ground, it like buries them. It pretends it's not happening. It doesn't do anything to talk to the people about them and explain why they're necessary, what's going on. We need to see climate emergency briefings, a bit like the COVID briefings. It's saying we are in a climate emergency. Parliament has declared a climate emergency. This is what it is. This is what it means. And this is what we need to do. But instead, it has this sort of very top-down approach where it just says, right, we know what to do. We've got the practical solutions. We're going to build these solar plants and these wind farms and these nuclear power stations and these transmission lines. And everyone else just get out the way, go away, clear off. A bit like the property developers, And it says, and it's curtailing planning objections and in order to get this through. And you say, well, that might in the short term work because it can get things built quickly. But in the long term, it just alienates and infuriates people and fails to engage people. And if you're going to have a big transition like this, you have to bring people with you. It's absolutely essential. And they might say, oh, well, if you think this is so important, why are you raising objections to the way we're doing it? Just get behind us and do it. Well, if you look at something which was just as important, say Britain's entry into the Second World War, they absolutely worked with hearts and minds. They were totally clear that you have to work with the people if that war effort was going to be successful, and went to tremendous lengths to explain the issue and engage people with it. But here we see this resounding silence coupled with these quite draconian measures which people really resent. Now, of course, we desperately and urgently need this green transition, and it's actually good for us in a whole load of ways. It brings down energy bills by complete contrast to the lies being told every day by the right-wing media, the billionaire press. It can make our homes much more habitable, whether in heat or in cold, and our schools and all our other public buildings, which desperately need to be re-equipped to deal with temperature extremes, but also to produce fewer emissions themselves. We could have a much more rational transport system, which gets people from A to B more efficiently without these huge traffic jams and the enormous environmental implications, etc. You can go on and on, but showing how, even if there weren't a climate crisis, it would make sense to be doing all of these things. It would make economic sense. It makes social sense to be doing all of these things. So, there's so many reasons to go ahead as fast as we possibly can in the midst of this climate emergency, but it has to be sold to the public. People need to be brought along with it. And this government has utterly and totally failed to do that. It's a tragedy.
I suppose, let me put forward, the defense of the government's overall strategy when it comes to climate, not necessarily the details. We can talk about that later. But in terms of the idea that I think there is a theory of politics and a theory of sort of the politics of climate change, which says climate change is not a vote-winning issue. The people that care about it are already the people who would vote for us, or the Greens now, but not sort of the reformed, curious people who they think are going to decide elections. What people really care about is their bills. We're going to talk about the cost of living, and the planning reform feeds into that, because I know you think this is undermining local democracy to some extent. They would say, I presume, that the only way we can get energy bills down whilst going for electrification is a much faster build out of energy lines, distribution networks, as well as sort of onshore wind farms, solar, etc. And to do that quickly, we really do need to make sure that there can't be consistent local objections, because it's in the national interest to get this stuff built out. And if we talk all the time about climate change while energy bills are still high, that will end up being a stick that we're beaten with. What we need to do is get those bills down and then claim credit for it afterwards. How would you respond to that?
So I'd say that there are nice and effective ways of getting things done quickly, and there are nasty and counterproductive ways of getting things done quickly. So a nice and effective way is to do what is often done in Denmark, which is to offer people a share in the money generated by these new schemes. So if you've got a big solar scheme occupying a lot of land around you, which will change the landscape character, a lot of people would object to that. You say, okay, the community is going to get a big chunk of the money that solar scheme is going to generate. And so, yeah, there is a downside for you. We do accept that, but there's also an upside, and you're going to get a new village hall and community centre and youth club and Shore Start Centre, or whatever, the local need is. This money can supply that, and supply that for many years to come. You'll have this constant pipeline of funding coming in for a whole load of community initiatives, and you can buy land and have new recreational areas, whatever, with that money. And that is a highly effective way of getting things done quickly while bringing people with you. Or you can take the draconian approach, saying, right, just shut up and put up. You're having this. Any objections are going to be slapped down. We're going to dismiss you as blockers, as NIMBYs, as zealots. And we're going to say you are the scum of the earth for having the temerity to object to this essential green transition. Well, fine. You'll get it done quickly. You'll antagonize people, turn them against you, turn them even towards reform, even people who understand about the climate transition and why it's necessary, just because you have royally pissed them off. I mean, how is that a sensible or sustainable strategy? It just doesn't make any sense, even in simple political terms.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've got the Denmark example. I mean, France, I'm not an expert on exactly what their planning law is, but the sense I get from sort of the things I read is that it is much more the case that when the government wants to build something, they kind of just can. And that, in a way, has created an environment where people say, oh, actually, high-speed rail, yeah, really good. There is an expectation that you can build through sort of agricultural land if you want to build a high-speed rail. Yes, they should compensate people, but it might not be the case that the landowner gets the veto in a way that they seem to some degree in this country.
Yeah, and it's true that in France they're dirigiste in a whole load of ways that in the UK we're not. But in the UK there's a whole lot of ways which you could be dirigiste in a really positive sense. You could say, right, we're not going to let business call all the shots. We are going to be far more proactive in building social housing, for instance, in creating the public services the country needs. Here, the government's constantly rolling over for business while then suddenly imposing these draconian provisions. And whether that's their anti-protest laws or their shutting down of planning objections, we see this really authoritarian streak at work. But it only works in extremely limited circumstances. And those are the circumstances where it aligns with what corporate lobbyists are telling it to do. And so, for instance, when Rachel Reeves explained her attack on the planning system, she said that the idea was conceived at a smoked salmon and scrambled egg breakfast with corporate lobbyists. Keir Starmer in the Times said that his recognition that the planning system had to change came from his discussion with leading CEOs. And the whole idea that this is being done for our benefit is just bollocks. Sorry, but it really is just straight up bollocks. This is corporate lobbying at work. And so they're prepared to be really vicious and authoritarian when the corporations demand it, or indeed when, Elbit Systems, government of Israel, whatever, demands that Palestine Action is banned as a terrorist group and thousands of elderly people with signs are rounded up as terrorists. Yeah, they're prepared to go all the way with that. But when it comes to delivering public services, when it comes to taxing the rich, when it comes to all these other measures which they do rather better in France now, no, it won't do that at all. So, you can explain government policy in this country far more successfully by looking at how it does or does not align with corporate and oligarchic power than you can by any other means. And this is the case with the green transition just as much as anything else. So there's a whole load of measures which urgently also need to happen, but there's no corporate lobby for them. So, for instance, the government should be encouraging us to switch towards a plant-based diet. No corporate lobby at all, no government messaging, no meat tax, none of the dirigiste measures which could encourage that. On the other hand, there's this unbelievably expensive and completely unnecessary carbon capture and storage project, which all the big oil majors, Exxon, BP, Shell, Equinor, Total, and the rest have been lobbying for, which could cost us between now and 2050, £264 billion, and will increase emissions rather than decreasing them. So, if you're trying to understand this, as this is the government's attempt to deal with climate issues as effectively as possible, your head will spin because none of it makes any sense. But if you try to understand this as this is the way in which the government is paying lip service to the green transition while giving corporations what they want, then it all makes perfect sense and it all lines up.
I wanted to ask you about carbon capture and storage, actually. So we'll come back to that in a moment. First of all, though, because you have in this conversation said the government are doing some good things on climate, and now you've sort of been quite damning of them on climate. So I wondered briefly, what do you think they have done right on climate? And I suppose, people have praised Ed Miliband in that department.
Yeah, the good side of it, and this I think is very much Ed Miliband sticking to his guns, is that it has not abandoned the carbon budgeting process. It has not abandoned the net zero aim. And they've come under enormous pressure to do so from Tony Blair, above everyone else, who's been just ferocious in trying to rip down climate policy in this country. Just happens to take vast amounts of money. The Tony Blair Institute from fossil fuel interests happens to be strongly aligned with the Saudi government. We could go on and on. But honestly, this guy, in my view now, is up there with Farage as one of the most evil people in Britain. But also, being very strongly lobbied by the media, by the other parties, political parties, by lobbyists in general, to shut down the net zero program. And they have not shut it down. They have adopted the new carbon budget, the 7th carbon budget, which takes you from 2038 to 2042. And they are trying to align policy with that, to largely successfully, but there will be some failures. This carbon capture and storage program is not going to work. The complete failure to engage with a whole lot of more personal stuff, that is a huge problem. So, they've done the easy bit so far, which changing the electricity system. Unless you've got a pylon going through your land, unless you're surrounded by a solar farm or something, the great majority of people, you don't notice any difference at all. You switch the light on and the light comes on. It's electricity. It's the same electricity. We don't care where it comes from. And they can get on with that. It's remote. But when it comes to things which we have to be involved in, like changing our transport networks, for instance, stopping us from driving massive, great SUVs, getting people much more into public transport, improving public transport, active travel, walking and cycling and all that, then you can't do that all at a distance. You have to involve people and engage people. And even more the case with diet, which is this hugely neglected environmental issue, because an animal-based diet is just massively more damaging than a plant-based diet. Government has done absolutely nothing about that. It won't go there at all. So it's done this sort of easy, remote, technocratic stuff, but it won't do the political stuff.
You mean presumably it sees, because there's an argument about meat where it's the meat industry, but presumably that's also just they'd be terrified of an electoral backlash if they start sort of raising the price. So if you put a tax on meat, you are going to be raising the price of meat, right? So if the Tories can point to the Labour government and say they've made your chicken dinner more expensive, you can see why they might be choosing other routes to try to get to net zero, but you presumably don't think that's a good enough excuse.
Yeah, and eventually you will hit the wall, because if you're trying to get to net zero but you're not doing anything about diet, you will fail. It is that simple, because diet is a big part of our greenhouse gas emissions, and this is why they're relying. Mostly because of corporate lobbying, but the other reason they're relying on carbon capture and storage, we can magic all the emissions away by pumping them under the ground. Well, you can't. It's just not going to work. And in the great majority of cases, all you're doing is commissioning new fossil fuel infrastructure. And so it's like, all those two difficult things, which are things like diet and aviation, because there aren't any techno fixes which really work for aviation, but they want aviation to keep growing, and they've been pushing for a third runway at Heathrow, etc. All that stuff. We'll just deal with it by pumping emissions under the ground, literally sweeping it under the carpet, out of sight, out of mind. That'll sort it out, which would be fine if that worked, but it doesn't. So they're going to run into a real crunch. But of course, it's not them who's going to run into it. It's going to be some future government, which will suddenly be landed with the fact that way down the line, close to 2050, when we're supposed to reach net zero, we're not going to be anywhere near net zero, because these crucial issues such as diet and aviation haven't been dealt with.
Let's talk about carbon capture and storage, because the announcement from the Labour government, I think it was a year ago or so, wasn't it? It was made by Ed Miliband, I think, was to say that the government is going to invest £22 billion in carbon capture and storage until 2050. I know from your work, you think that figure could end up being a lot higher. But so just to put the argument as to why this might be a good use of money, I don't understand the physics of carbon capture and storage, so I'm not in any way an authority on whether or not it can work. But sort of the political economy argument as to why it might be useful, as an investment is to say the UK is only 1 or less than 1% of global emissions. Obviously, that doesn't take away our moral responsibility to do everything we can to get to zero. But ultimately, the biggest bang we're going to get for our buck is if we develop some kind of technology which can be exported to the rest of the world. There are certain industries which it is very difficult to electrify. So fossil fuels will likely still be used in those industries around the world. So cement, concrete, they're sort of the classic ones that people bring up. And therefore, even if it's a long shot, even if it's very possible that we invest all of this money and it doesn't come up with the goods, if there's even a small chance that this money does come up with a viable technology for carbon capture and storage, then that could be, the most important thing we do as a country when it comes to solving the climate challenge. So I suppose, how would you respond to that kind of argument?
Sure. Okay. Well, for a start, this is by no means the first government to have attempted this. And there's efforts in Canada and Australia, in the Gulf states, in many other parts of the world, North America, attempting carbon capture and storage, but it keeps failing. And there are some pretty fundamental reasons why it's failed. In fact, this isn't even the first attempt in the UK. We tried in 2005, 2007 and 2012, and all those hit the buffers as well, with a large amount of money spent. In this case, they're going hell for leather, putting vast amounts of taxpayers' and bill payers' money into an unproven technology. Now, if you were to try yet again to do a demonstration project, and if you were to get that right, you might say, okay, then we'll invest in the next stage. But it's like one enormous demonstration project on various sites around the country with tens or hundreds of billions being put behind it. It's not sequenced right. It's absolutely mad to be just going straight into it before you've actually demonstrated the model, which they patently have not. And you're quite right about cement. So cement and chemicals really are the two very hard to abate industries. Not impossible in all cases. For instance, it doesn't have to be ordinary Portland cement that we build with. You can use what are called geopolymers instead. And the Romans used them. This is a very well-established technology. There's a very large range of things you can use to make concrete, that you can use as a clinker. So cement is used as a clinker in concrete, which sticks it all together. There are lots of other potential materials. And, again, there's a lot of sort of sunk costs, vested interest. People don't really want to change that model. You could do. Perhaps not for all uses. So you'd still have some emissions from cement plants and from chemicals plants. And were the carbon capture and storage program focused entirely on those, I would absolutely support it. But as Andrew Boswell and Simon Aldridge, two climate specialists, have shown, only between 5 and 6% of all the planned carbon capture and storage is for cement and chemicals. Nearly all the rest of it is attached to new fossil fuel burning or fossil fuel splitting to produce what's called blue hydrogen, or biomass burning, all of which are a total environmental disaster and will cause far more emissions than will be buried through carbon capture and storage. And basically, it's a lifeline for the fossil fuel industry. According to the Climate Change Committee, the government's committee, by 2050, half of all the fossil fuel we burn in this country will be for carbon capture and storage programs. It's just totally mad. But it's been driven all the way through by corporate lobbying, by the fossil fuel industry's lobbying. Now, this 21.7 billion, which the government announced, as you rightly say, it was about a year and a half ago. It made this announcement, and that was pretty damn eye-watering all by itself. But what I didn't realize at the time of that announcement was that this was just for phase one. And phase one is just a handful of projects in two clusters, one in the northeast and one in the northwest of England. And it's those clusters are then going to be expanded, and there's going to be a whole load of new clusters built. And the analysis that Boswell and Aldridge have come up with, and what they've had to do, is to look at all these separate spreadsheets, because quite deliberately, in my view, the Climate Change Committee has not compiled them in one place. It's not the independent and unbiased organisation it claims to be, because if it were, it would be straight with us about what the outlay for this is going to be. But bringing together all those figures, have found the potential cost is £264 billion between now and 2050, over £250 billion. Now, not all of that will be borne by the public. Some of it will be private. But given the absolute catastrophe of carbon capture and storage so far, we can expect the state to be carrying more and more of those costs, almost certainly the great majority of those costs, or bill payers. And the Public Accounts Committee at the House of Commons found that the share is likely to be 25-75. So the state would carry 25%, 75% would go on our electricity bills. Perhaps the government should explain this to us, that it intends to put up to £198 billion extra on our electricity bills for a carbon capture and storage program that will increase greenhouse gas emissions. Let's see how popular that would be.
And you say it would increase emissions because it's the excuse by which we're building more fossil fuel infrastructure, essentially,
exactly.
Even in sectors where renewables would work.
Okay, so if you look at the electricity system, for instance, there's loads of ways of producing electricity, and we now know that we could have a 100% green electricity system because battery technology, grid-scale batteries, have evolved at great speed, much faster than people projected, and they're able to store very large amounts of power, which means that you can have a balanced and reliable grid entirely built from renewable sources. So you just don't need fossil fuels whatsoever. But the only thing that is going to keep fossil fuels on the grid is these gas-burning plants associated with carbon capture and storage. And because they will mean that the UK has to maintain or increase its demand for gas, much of that will be coming in the form of liquefied natural gas, liquefied fossil gas from the United States, which has a higher carbon footprint than coal because of all the methane leaks along the chain. And so even if you're burying that part of the emissions produced by burning the stuff, that does nothing about the methane links all the way from the fracking site to the liquefaction plant, through the storage to the release into the power station when you get here. All of that is not accounted for, and that's a great majority of the emissions, about 75%, that liquefied natural gas will be responsible for. So you'll be greatly increasing emissions, even if you succeed in burying the carbon dioxide emissions caused by burning the stuff. But there's no guarantee that they're even going to succeed in that. So what we're likely to end up with is a whole load of gas-burning power stations which aren't ameliorated by carbon capture and storage and ensure that we remain hooked on fossil fuels when we could be shedding them.
Just to clarify, are we building new gas-fired power stations, or is this sort of retrofitting old ones?
They're building new ones specifically for the purpose of the carbon capture and storage program.
Right. Yeah, I have to admit, I didn't realize we were actually building new.
It's madness, utter madness.
I thought this was an issue about sort of the existing ones. Yes, that's very persuasive. I mean, the methane argument really important because often people say about fracking, the gas. If the gas is replacing coal, it's all good because gas is less polluting than coal. But it's the methane that is released in the process. I mean, our audience probably know methane, much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. The difference is it's very powerful but short lasting, whereas carbon dioxide slightly less powerful but longer lasting. I want to talk about another issue in terms of sort of research, because I think that answer that you've given makes a lot of sense. Sort of what I was putting forward was an argument for fundamental research in carbon capture and storage, because if someone can make the technology work, then you can export it as that. And you're saying this is actually funding for deployment of it before the fundamental research has come up with a good. Something the government is sort of putting research money into, and it is sort of genuine, fundamental, basic research, is into geoengineering. So ARIA and the Advanced Research and Invention Agency was one that was set up by Dominic Cummings, inspired by DARPA in the United States. They're putting £57 million into funding experiments into direct cooling projects. This is geoengineering and mainly solar radiation management, as far as I understand. In your perspective, is that money well spent?
Well, for a start, it is a much smaller amount of money than we're talking about. I mean, this is millions, not billions. So obviously, a few tens of millions here, a few tens of millions there. It's pretty soon you're talking real money, but in terms of government budget, it's pretty small. It's sort of typical research funding that the government will do. So in terms of the fiscal outlay, that's not so much of an issue. In terms of where we want to end up, well, we need a very serious debate about this because, while I can understand the argument that we've so screwed this up, we've so failed to step up in time that we're committing ourselves to massive pulse of global heating, which is going to have devastating consequences on many of the world's people. There are quite a few dangers with this whole solar radiation management approach. And one of them is the moral hazard, because it says, oh, well, we don't need to deal with any of these fossil fuel industries. We don't need to change our energy systems, our food systems, anything like that, because we'll just screen out the incoming solar radiation by pumping sulfur dioxide, sulfate particles into the air. And that'll sort everything out. Well, for a start, it doesn't sort everything out because you still get your ocean acidification, for example, caused by carbon dioxide dissolving in seawater. You still get all the devastating impacts of the fossil fuel industry. You still have all the better world we would otherwise have had being denied to us, all those things which we should be doing anyway, climate crisis or no. And it's basically a license for business as usual. And of course, we know that because we know how politics works, that the billionaire press and others will immediately leap on it and say, there you are, then we don't need to take any of these other actions. So there's a huge moral hazard involved. And then you've got this thing called termination shock, that if it stops for any reason, and, this reason could be generations down the line, 100 years, 200 years down the line, we've been maintaining a steady climate by this fairly extreme intervention, pumping sulfur dioxide or other particles into the air and creating this radiation screening. And then, who knows, war, state collapse, fiscal crisis, all sorts of things could stop that. And then suddenly, bang, you've got all those carbon emissions already in the atmosphere. And you go from what might have been reduced to 1.5 degrees of global heating as a result of, or maintained at the level we got now as a result of radiation screening, up to 4 or 5 degrees, and sudden, massive, disruptive, possibly Earth systems destroying environmental shock. Can we really guarantee that this is going to continue unabated for hundreds of years into the future? No, I don't think we can. I really don't think we can. So even if you accepted the practical case for it, and there is a case, I don't deny that there is a case, even if you were to accept that, there are some very dangerous political issues associated with it.
Do you still think the research is worth doing, though, I suppose, because obviously a lot of this depends on what the consequences would be. So if it were the case that this only worked if you put like highly poisonous particles into the air, or if you did this, the most worrying sort of possible outcome, I think, is that it changes the monsoon season and therefore differentially affects people in the most vulnerable parts of the world. So obviously a lot more experiments need to be done before deployment happens. But in general, do you think that it's right that these experiments are happening, or do you think this should still be a no-go area?
On the whole, I'm in favour of research. I think that, it's good to know more. It's good to know where the land lies. The research might discover that it's not going to work for various reasons, or that the hazards outweigh the benefits for the sort of reasons you're saying. And we should know that. We should know that rather than being rushed into something when we haven't done the demonstration projects. It takes us back to the carbon capture and storage issue. I'm not against finding out. I think it's a good idea to find out, as long as that's not then considered to be a green light to go ahead with the whole program without a proper full-on investigation, societal debate. You've got to involve the people. These can't be just technocratic decisions. It can't be just a committee of scientists, of technicians deciding this is the way forward, this is how we're going to do it, which unfortunately is the government position. That we don't need the people in this. We know what's right. We just need to apply it. And it just doesn't work. It's not good politics and it's not democratic. We have to bring people into this. Citizens' assemblies would be a really good way of discussing these issues, backed by a proper parliamentary mandate, much as they did in Ireland with the debate over abortion or equal marriage legislation. When you've got difficult, knotty issues like this, which might have a technical component, but also a moral component, political component, all of that stuff, then, bring the people into it. Allow us our say, allow us to be part of the deliberative process.
And let me put forward, I'm not saying I think this is the most likely scenario, but when I sort of think about the future and climate change, the most positive outcome that I think is plausible, right? So sort of without a sort of complete radical transformation of the social world, is that it turns out that geoengineering, sort of one of these strategies, so stratospheric aerosol injection, so putting some kind of particle into the stratosphere to reflect some sunlight, or marine cloud brightening. It turns out that one of these works, and that gives us some extra time. Obviously, there's a risk of termination shock, which is why you would have to just sort of do it constantly. There would, as you say, be this big sort of moral hazard, which is that all the newspapers would start saying, okay, this is brilliant. Now we can go and get North Sea oil. The problem's gone. However, the green transition is already in process, right? The extent to which batteries have declined in price, the extent to which solar and wind has declined in price, the extent to which people now just believe electric cars are better than petrol cars, means that the barriers to a green transition are smaller than they were, say, 10 years ago if they'd discovered geoengineering then. And therefore, geoengineering can be used, as the scientists who promote it want it to be used for, is as a bridging technology, because we are in a position now where we are moving towards net zero. We're just not doing it fast enough to avoid some of those tipping points. And therefore, we need some geoengineering to stop the tipping points while we get to zero sort of over the next 70 or so years. What I'm not saying whether or not you think that's the most likely outcome. I mean, I don't think it's the most likely outcome. But do you see that as a sort of plausible, one of the positive visions, or one of the least bad visions that we could have, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not ideologically opposed to it. We should be open-minded. We should be open to discussing these issues, and I'm happy to hear the case. And if someone has a better case, then I'd be delighted to hear that better case. We have messed it up. We have given ourselves very little time. In fact, the time has already run out for many of the world's people and the world's ecosystems. We're already seeing devastating impacts of climate breakdown, and we're seeing them in the heat waves here and now in this country. Extreme times do call for extreme measures. Whether this is the right one, I'm skeptical of it, but I'm not closing my mind. I just don't think we can afford to close our minds. So this is why research, demonstration projects, stuff like that, those have a role. That's valid. That's fine. But plunging straight in, just going for it without that public process, that does not have a role.
Yeah, on a really big picture level, actually. So I suppose I'll just put forward what is my most plausible vision for how we avoid catastrophe, let's say. It's because, obviously when you look at the scientific models, it looks like it's going to be really bad. And that to me seems like the vision that seems both plausible and not disastrous. What to you is the most sort of plausible, non-disastrous outcome that we could sort of achieve over the next 30 years?
So I think, and I think this is plausible. I think it is a major social tipping point. Much like I mentioned before, the situation in Ireland where citizens' assemblies help them to deliberate on these enormously fraught issues of the right to abortion and equal marriage legislation. It was unthinkable in Ireland even to be discussing those things just a decade before that point. Ireland was a Catholic theocracy. You couldn't discuss those things. You couldn't. There were some very brave people who campaigned openly for them, but boy, did they have a lot of shit thrown at them. It was a horrible situation, and the idea that it should become this sort of sexually liberated country, which it has become to a large extent today. Obviously, there's still a long way to go everywhere, but it's been a huge transformation. In Ireland, of all places, that was just unthinkable. But in combination with the disgraceful scandals about the Catholic Church, the sort of contact with other countries in the European Union and other aspects of modernity, suddenly things shifted to an unimaginable degree. It went from one stable state to another stable state. In systems theory, we talk about these as equilibrium states. And I believe that society, which is itself a complex system, has two equilibrium states. One is called impossible and the other is called inevitable. So from the point of view of anything we want to achieve, it's always impossible. Oh no, you couldn't possibly do that. Votes for women, you had to be off your rocker. Independence for India, they'll never let it go. Whatever the issue is, it's just impossible. It looks like a brick wall. It's how on earth are we ever going to scale that? It can't be done. And then, woof, massive social tipping point, and everyone says, well, that was inevitable, wasn't it? And I think we could be heading towards that with climate issues. For some of the reasons that you've listed already, is that it's cheaper. Renewables now are a lot cheaper than fossil fuel. In 90% of situations around the world, producing your electricity, your power source being renewable rather than fossil fuels is cheaper. Now that itself counts for an enormous amount. Electric cars, as you say, are better. Electrified mass transit is better still. There's loads and loads of reasons why we would want to make that transition, even if it weren't for climate. And then when you see the sort of discrediting, similar to what we've seen with the Catholic Church in Ireland, as the big proponents and noisy people pushing for continued fossil fuel use, one by one are exposed as the absolute shysters we always knew they were, and Nigel Farage is a very good example of this. We could see things happening at what is currently an unimaginable speed. That there's this sudden disgust with that whole fossil fuel-based economy and a very powerful public desire for a climate-aligned economy, for an eco-civilization, if you like, to use Jeremy Lent's term. And then we could see the flip happening very fast indeed. And that's happened on many issues worldwide at tremendous speed. So, we have the danger of hitting environmental tipping points, which are very big and very scary. And we don't want to be crossing those tipping points because the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation could stall, and suddenly we have freezing winters and dry summers, and life becomes pretty uninhabitable here in the UK. But you also got your potential for social tipping points where public attitudes and public practice just change overnight. And the key question, perhaps the biggest question we've ever faced, is whether we can hit the social tipping points before we hit the environmental tipping points.
And that's always been the sort of essential problem of climate politics, though, hasn't it? Which is that when you think what would create the social tipping point, the most obvious example is a very extreme weather event, which is undeniably sort of an effect of climate change. And one could say we've already seen a lot, but they haven't caused a tipping point yet. So maybe it's going to have to be really, really, really extreme. And by the time the climate event is really, really extreme, it's too late to avoid the tipping point. So, this is, and I suppose that's why sort of in the most plausible, decent outcome involves winning a bit of time through some techno fix. I'm not saying that that's a better example than very argument than you're putting forward, but it's the timing of the tipping points, or the timing problem when it comes to those tipping points that concerns me, I suppose. Do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from for a start. That it is, the clock is ticking, and we don't know where a tipping point is. until you're past it. That is the problem. It's until you've gone over the cliff, you don't know where the cliff edge is in terms of environmental systems. The danger, of course, is that if you deploy a technofix like solar radiation management, pumping stuff into the atmosphere, then that could actually suck the energy out of social change movements and prevent that social tipping point from happening at all. And if we achieve where we want to be through a social tipping point, we'll be in a much better place than if we achieve it through a technofix and we haven't addressed any of the underlying problems which are driving not just climate breakdown, but social injustice, inequality, exclusion, marginalization, all these other issues. So if we can achieve this by social means, that would be the ideal outcome. And that's not a luxury. For all sorts of reasons, we need this social transformation to take place. But I totally recognize we are facing an emergency, a climate emergency, and these sorts of desperate last-ditch emergency measures might be necessary. It's really hard to call because we just don't know how close we are.
Let's change the subject slightly. I want to talk about rewilding and farming. You've written books about both of them. I suppose I think I often talk about them a bit flippantly because I haven't done the deep research, but sort of I really like the idea of rewilding sort of half the agricultural land, then doing vertical farming on a quarter of it and building new cities on the other quarter. That's kind of my YIMBY brain. And I want to know from someone who actually has done the research, whether in any way I'm on the right track.
Well, sort of. Some elements of that, yeah. Look, there's a huge amount of land we could rewild in this country and lose almost no food production at all. If you look at the hill farming in this country, produces a very small amount of lamb and mutton, tiny amount of beef at the cost of enormous environmental devastation. Our hills should be forested. We should have trees growing on almost all the highland in Britain. The only places which might be above the altitudinal tree line are Ben Nevis and the top of the Cairngorms. That's it. Everywhere else is below the tree line. And the only reason there aren't trees is the vast population of sheep, cattle and deer. And the sheep and cattle are subsidized. They wouldn't be there at all if it weren't for us paying for them to be there. And so this current system makes no sense at all. And we should be focusing agriculture on productive land, and on much less productive land, we should be using that for ecological restoration because we desperately need that. We're one of the most ecologically depleted countries in the world. And just as we need to be pulling our weight on climate, we need to be pulling our weight on ecosystems as well, because what we now know is that Earth systems depend for their survival on wild and healthy ecosystems. One of the things pushing Earth systems towards collapse, towards that disastrous tipping point, is the massive depletion of wild ecosystems. So then you would say, right, basically the lowlands, those are good for productive agriculture. That's where we should be focusing it. The higher land, I would love to see much richer ecosystems brought back, missing species brought back, such as lynx and wolves, for example, which are brilliant at repairing ecosystems, at making them function better. We're massively overpopulated by deer in this country, which is why it's so hard to establish new woodland, because they nibble away all the tree seedlings. Wolves and lynx would help us to sort that out. But then as for, food production, vertical farming is pretty well a non-starter. It's just far too expensive. It doesn't really work. But there is huge potential in what's called precision fermentation, which is turning our attention to the millions and millions of microbe species, which have potentially very high food value, but we don't exploit at all. We don't even look at, we haven't even been thinking of them. And some of them are delicious. I can testify to that. And they can be produced with a tiny fraction of the land, a tiny fraction of the greenhouse gases, tiny fraction of the water that agriculture uses. And they can produce much better substitutes for animal products. And this is the key thing. It's a bit like where we are at the moment is like with fossil fuels, but as if we didn't have any very good renewables to replace them with. we do have plant-based substitutes for animal products, but most of them aren't that great. Plants are not where you would start because they have low concentrations of protein, different proteins, tied up with all sorts of plant secondary chemicals, which make them taste very different to meat, or eggs or cheese or anything. So you'd be much better off starting with microbes, and you've got huge potential there, absolutely massive. And it has to be said, this is one area in which the UK is at least funding some research, and we hope it goes somewhere.
And what are the barriers to that? Because I'm very excited about lab grown meat. Like it very much, I suppose, fits into my philosophy, which is sort of like, let's innovate our way out of this.
Yeah.
But I have to say, I'm also not sort of that on the ball in terms of where we are with it. Sort of some things I have read says it's still sort of incredibly expensive to produce, but I don't know what you think.
The first thing to say is that precision fermentation is not the same as lab grown meat. These are totally different technologies. You could potentially use precision fermentation products in growing a steak in a bioreactor, but that is incredibly expensive and difficult, lab grown meat, and I don't think it's ever really going to materialize. But also I don't think it has to, because with the products of precision fermentation, which are basically very high protein flour, that's what you're producing. It's super high protein flour, between 60 and 70% protein. You can very easily and quickly turn that into excellent substitutes for meat, for eggs, for milk products, and the rest of it, much more easily than you can with plant proteins. So it bypasses that need to grow your steak or tuna steak in a bioreactor, which is just phenomenally complicated and actually has got, in some respects, some fairly high environmental costs. This is much, much simpler. And there are many ways of sort of, formulating food products which can make some pretty realistic substitutes in terms of taste, texture, and the rest of it. The other great thing about microbial proteins is they need far less processing than plant products do, or even than some animal products. For instance, I visited a lab in the Netherlands where they are working with a pink bacterium. This is a wild state bacterium which smells and tastes of sausages. So all you basically need to do is to stuff them into tubes and you got your sausage. You don't even have to do any of the processing and all the additives and stuff which goes into making a pork sausage.
Amazing. When am I going to be able to try this? Or do I have to write a book about the food system to get a preview?
Yeah, so at the moment, the big barrier is regulatory. It's because the meat and livestock lobbies have just pushed to stop it. And they've been highly successful. European Union officials have rolled over again and again. You're not even allowed to call it oat milk anymore, or all these other terms which we were using. Suddenly, they've all been banned as a purely protectionist measure to stop these products from competing with dairy milk and meat and the rest of it. We don't ban kidney beans. We don't ban beef tomatoes. We don't ban shepherd's pie, even though it's got no shepherd in it. We don't ban jelly babies. We don't ban hot dogs, though some of them are probably made of dog. But, we do ban these plant-based substitutes for animal products, and they are putting every barrier they possibly can in the way of precision fermentation and all alternative protein development. And unfortunately, they're being assisted by some very conservative-minded Greens who say, oh, we don't want all this new stuff. We want to see sheep roaming freely in the fields and stuff. All right, eating all the tree seedlings and destroying the ecosystem, fine. Very environmental that is.
And what kind of environmentalists are colluding to? Because I mean, this is really, my ears are really pricking here. I want to speed up this process. I want these bacterial microbe sausages. Who are the Greens who are relying with the sort of meat and dairy industry to put a lid on this?
Yeah. So there's a sort of strong lobby of people like Chris Smage, Joanna Blytheman, who are coming out very strongly. We can't have any of this muck. We don't want this rubbish. And they are people, I would classify them as green social nostalgics. It's like the old ways are the best ways. We've got to get back to old-fashioned ways of doing it. They want to re-peasantize people. They want people to move out of the cities and into the countryside, a great sort of Zhejiang, sort of Chinese style movement back to the countryside. Cities are urban feedlots. We can't be doing with any of that. That's how Chris Mage describes them. And to me, this is just absolute madness. This isn't solving any problems at all. I mean, it's not going to happen. The great majority of people don't actually want to be building their own homes out of reeds and mud and growing their own food and making their own clothes. Cities are very successful places for people to live. We just want food which is going to be good for us, which is going to be cheap enough to buy, and which isn't going to devour the living planet. And these are some of the options. None of it is perfect. There's issues with every foodstuff we might possibly develop, and alternative proteins are no exception, but they offer potential ways out which could be absolutely transformative. I think they are possibly the most important environmental technologies ever developed.
Wow. Final question. You mentioned China, although in a very different context. And the context I'm going to ask you about China, will China save us?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the whole time we were told, there's no point in the UK doing anything about its emissions because China's building a new coal-fired power station every 5 minutes, and those Chinese are destroying the planet. Which was always a racist version of this yellow peril myth. We can't work an 8-hour day because the Chinese are working a 35-hour day, etc. It's always been used. The Chinese have always been used as a stick to destroy our own aspirations, and it's all their fault. But actually, what we're seeing in China is a green transition on an unimaginable scale, and they are now the world's supplier of solar panels and of new batteries and a huge range of environmental technologies. I mean, it's getting potentially dangerous how we are becoming so reliant on this one country for so much of our green technology. And we should have, in Europe and the UK, should have been putting much more into developing our own lines. However, at the moment, it's filling an enormous gap which we have left, and thank goodness it is. I'm no fan of the Chinese regime by any manner of means, but at least they're taking this issue seriously, and they are managing to make green technology much, much cheaper and more dispatchable than it was before.
You need to go and lobby the CCP when it comes to microbial sausages. Maybe they'll do it quicker than we will. George Monbiot, thank you so much for your time. I really, really do appreciate it. That was absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Total pleasure, Michael, as always. Really lovely to talk to you.